Hi, everyone. Hey. So welcome back. Friends, I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Sister Astell, Professor of Theology here at the University of Notre Dame, where she was appointed in 2007 after serving as Professor of English and Chair of Medieval Studies at Purdue University. Her research focuses on the intersections of theology, literature, and spirituality. She's the author of 6 books, and the writing of her most recent book, entitled Eating Beauty, the Eucharist and the Spiritual Arts of the Middle Ages, was supported by a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship. Her other books, The Song of Songs in the Middle Ages, Job, Boethius, and Epic Truth, Chaucer and the Universe of Learning, Political Allegory in Late Medieval England, and Joan of Arc and Sacrificial Authorship, all appeared between 1990 and 2003, and then her current book in 2006. She's also the editor or co-editor of 5 volumes on topics related to historical Christian spirituality, including Lay Sanctity, Medieval and Modern, A Search for Models from 2000, Joan of Arc and Spirituality from 2003, Levinas and Medieval Literature, The Difficult Reading of English and Rabbinic Texts, 2009, and Sacrifice, Scripture, and Substitution, Readings in Ancient Judaism and Christianity in 2011. A member of the Schoenstatt Sisters of Mary, she currently serves as president of the International Colloquium on Violence and Religion and as president of the Society for the Study of Christian Spirituality. Her lecture today is entitled Human Dignities of Death and Responsibility, Gabriel Marcel and Emmanuel Levinas. I'm sure you'll all join me in welcoming Sister Anne Astell.
Thank you, John. I suppose you're wondering what a medievalist is doing talking about Levinas and Gabriel Marcel. But I happened to be at Purdue University at the time that the North American Levinas Society was founded. And so that was kind of the start of my interest in Levinas. And so without further ado, all right. Confronting the horrors of 2 world wars, and especially the atrocities committed against the Jews, Gabriel Marcel and Emmanuel Levinas developed complementary philosophical responses to the acute anthropological questions raised by modern man's inhumanity toward man. Answering to this challenge, the Jewish phenomenologist Levinas offers a humanism of the other that effectively defines human dignity as responsibility. Marcel, a Catholic convert and the first of the modern French existentialists, entitled his 1961 William James Lectures at Harvard University, The Existential Background of Human Dignity. In their writings, both Levinas and Marcel decry the philosophical deficiency of the long Aristotelian tradition culminating in Kant, a tradition which had proven tragically helpless in moral and political terms to defend the lives of millions of people, their dignity defined at best as that of a rational, mortal animal. Both worry about the continued power of the biblical text to communicate convincingly to modern people its thesis. And here I quote Levinas, that man occupies an exceptional place in the world, having received a dignity of cause at God's creation of humankind in the image of God. If God is dead, as Nietzsche announces, if the notion of the creature conceived in the image of God therefore lapses at the same time, must we not draw the full conclusion from these premises, writes Marcel, and acknowledge that the idea of the human person is today without roots, that it is a survival, and can at the very most be treated only in an academic and anemic way. Perhaps there is no more serious problem than this, unquote. In part because Levinas seldom uses the phrase human dignity, preferring to approach the issue otherwise, scholars have missed the opportunity to stage a conversation on this topic between the two Francophone philosophers who knew each other from the 1930s, commented appreciatively on each other's writings, and were important interlocutors for one another. I aim to stage such an encounter today and to argue that the differences in their views of human dignity are fundamentally religious and theological, albeit located at points within a single Judeo-Christian continuum. As William Desmond remarks, read in a certain way, Marcel's Catholicism and Levinas's Judaism generate some very deep affinities. Claiming Judaism as a religion for adults, Levinas issues a call to godlike responsibility for the other and for the other's death, while Marcel champions a creative faith in and fidelity to another person. Anchored in the divine thou, such fidelity hopes to conquer even death. Levinas's philosophical masterpiece, Totality and Infinity, has its intellectual origins in the trauma of World War II. Its opening page proclaims a conceptual link between war and what Levinas calls totality. Quote, "The visage of being that shows itself in war is fixed in the concept of totality, which dominates Western philosophy. Individuals are reduced to being bearers of forces that command them unbeknownst to themselves," unquote. Long before psychologists like Jonathan Shea began to speak of moral injury as a form of post-traumatic stress syndrome, widespread among war veterans, Levinas pointed to the ethical problem. Quote, "The trial by force is the test of the real, but violence does not consist so much in injuring and annihilating persons as in interrupting their continuity, making them play roles in which they no longer recognize themselves, making them betray not only commitments but their own substance, making them carry out actions that will destroy every possibility for action." Levinas's words harken back to the haunting descriptions of indolence, fatigue, and insomnia found in Existence and Existence, first published in 1947, but largely composed in notebook jottings during the 5 years, 1940 to 45, when the French philosopher captured in combat was a prisoner of war in Stalag 11B near Hanover, Germany. There, Levinas imagines his own continued existence as an anonymity in a darkness full of nothingness. Marcel's Gifford lectures of 1949 and 50, entitled The Mystery of Being, begin with a similar reference to a broken world, viewed as a totality. Quote, "We live today in a world at war with itself, yet whole and single. It is from this very unity and totality that it draws its sinister new power of self-destruction," unquote. Citing Nietzsche's will to power, Marcel points to the two processes of atomization and collectivization as productive of a social nudity, a social stripping that leaves a human being with nothing but an official or functional identity. Marcel's 1952 book, Man Against Mass Society, insistently links the totalizing forces not only of fascism, but also of modern capitalism to questions of human dignity. Reducing the value of the individual to his probable outcome, he writes, implies that the individual has no dignity of his own, as he would have, for example, if he were considered in relation to God a creator in whose image he was made. A reflective empiricist, Marcel sees at mid-century what Pope Francis will later call the technocratic paradigm as a threat to human dignity, not only because some individual technologies are a means for mass destruction and others work to disrupt relations of human intimacy, definitive of the human, but also because they instrumentalize and commodify human beings, treating them as a means to other ends. Marcel includes among the techniques of human degradation the burgeoning bureaucracies and the various forms of propaganda and advertising disseminated through the new media. Most importantly, Marcel warns against a technologizing of thought itself, which would reduce the mysteries of life, faith, family, and community to mere problems to be solved. In this regard, as Meryl Westphal rightly notes, Marcel is also an epistemologist and a witness. Through an investigation independent from that of Martin Buber, whose I and Thou appeared in 1923, Marcel, in his metaphysical journey, composed in entries written during World War I, had come to the recognition that the human being must be understood as a being in relation to others, an intersubjectivity, whose I is constituted in response to the call, the summons of another person. It has become astonishingly clear, writes Marcel, that man must be considered as a vocation and not, as was perhaps appropriate until relatively recently, as nature. Reflecting back on his life's work in a conversation with Paul Ricoeur, Marcel observes, quote, I was trying to recover the traditional notion of the person, of personal dignity, but at the same time to avoid giving this notion a purely rational basis in the Kantian sense of rational, unquote. Regarded in isolation, apart from relationship with others, the individual is, according to Marcel, quote, without a visage, without eyes, a specimen, a scrap, whereas the person in relation, who confronts and is confronted, who answers to a call, quote, tends to posit itself as wholly responsible for history, unquote. Note the references here in Marcel to responsibility and visage, important terms in the Levinasian lexicon. Intersubjectivity, in the sense of Marcel, cannot be regarded as a simple fact because, quote, it takes on value only when it appears as a progressive conquest of everything that threatens us with self-centeredness, unquote. As Levinas acknowledges, his own version of intersubjectivity owes much to Buber and Marcel. Already in Existence and Existence, Levinas affirms that the solitary subject cannot save or pardon himself in his isolation, nor can he be saved through participation in the side-by-side Heideggerian with one another, mit ein Andersein of the collective. For Levinas, both scenarios constitute an immersion in the same. For a release from each one's self-enclosure, a genuine alterity, exterior to the self, confronting the self, is needed. The other as other is not only an alter ego, explains Levinas. He is what I am not. He is the weak one, whereas I am the strong one. He is the poor one, the widow, the orphan. Or else the other is the stranger, the enemy, the powerful one, unquote. What is crucial for Levinas is that the intersubjective space be initially asymmetrical and heterogeneous. In his interpretation of Exodus 11:7, but against any of the people of Israel, not a dog shall growl, Levinas relates an anecdote that may be understood as a parable of this asymmetrical relationship. He recalls how a stray dog wandered into the Stalag in Germany, where he and thousands of his compatriots were prisoners of war. Stripped of our human skin, Levinas comments, we were subhuman, a gang of apes, beings entrapped in their species, deprived of language with which to deliver a message about our humanity. The prisoners, however, could give a name, could give the dog a name, Bobby, and he could act expressively in accordance with his animal nature as the friend of man, greeting the prisoners with his happy barks and jumps. Attesting at once to the transcendent dignity of his own animal and their human natures, the dog, observes Levinas, was, quote, the last Kantian in Nazi Germany, albeit without the brain needed to universalize maxims and drives, unquote. Diane Perpich concludes, the point of the story is then that reason may not be what makes you ethical, and that acknowledgement of the other as such, or as a being who counts outside of every calculus and schema, is, unquote. As a parable of the asymmetrical intersubjective relationship, Levinas' story of the dog Bobby and the human prisoners raises many questions pertinent to the topic of human dignity. Can a dog, a non-human, have, and can it really recognize what Levinas calls a face? Levinas himself largely skirted these questions, but he endeavored to answer a related one. How other must the Levinasian other be? Gabriel Marcel was among the first to pose the question to Levinas. Reading Totality and Infinity at its publication in 1961, Marcel found it, quote, rather surprising that in designating a person who is other, but who at the same time presents himself to me to be not only confronted but greeted, Levinas does not use the term neighbor, my neighbor, unquote. As Marcel anticipated, and perhaps at his prompting, Levinas went on to incorporate the language of neighbor and proximity alongside that of otherness in his subsequent work, especially Otherwise Than Being or Beyond Essence, 1974. In Existence and Existence, and Time and the Other, Levinas already intones this neighborly language, of course, but only to qualify it and to exercise a preference for a vocabulary of alterity. Because in the reciprocity of relations characteristic of civilization, the asymmetry of the intersubjective relationship is forgotten. The reciprocity of civilization, the kingdom of ends, where each one is both end and means, a person and personnel, is a leveling of the idea of fraternity, unquote. As Levinas explains, true fraternity is not a relationship of equals united by resemblance, but rather it presupposes individualities and the commonness of a father, a human kingship signified by monotheism. Levinas contrasts the idea of the human race as a fraternity stemming from a common father on the one hand, with that on the other of a humanity united by resemblance, a multiplicity of diverse families arisen from the stones cast behind by Deucalion, and which across the struggle of egoisms results in a human city. In this, Levinas and Marcel are in perfect accord. According to Marcel, the notion of equality is centered on a human consciousness claiming its own rights. It takes the self as the default measure of the same, the hegemonic and the rivalrous, as if to say, I am your equal, I'm just as good as you. Fraternity, by contrast, is centered on the other person. You are my brother. As it is for Levinas, fraternity is a major theme for Marcel, who describes fatherhood as a vocation, the carrying out of a responsibility, shouldered and sustained, and as a teaching of responsibility to one's children. For Levinas, however, there's a real distinction between the neighbor or family member, above all the feminine, beloved, who is thou, and the stranger, the other who confronts me in neediness and commands my service, as a you. A single person may in fact be a gentle thou for me at one moment and a commanding you at another, as the ethical relationships in time and circumstance. In this way, the interiority of home and family in Levinas, an interiority that disrupts totality and provides a means, albeit fallible and imperfect, for withdrawal from it, can and indeed must open again and again in hospitality shown to a stranger, a refugee. The Levinasian other is always other, non-equal to itself, never the same, carrying a path forward, presaging a future, and veiling a third party, and ilaity. Named in the third person, God's alterity or ilaity, transcendent to the point of absence, is what Levinas calls the he at the root of the you, the very source of the ethical imperative, you shall not kill, Exodus 20:13. What Levinas, appropriating the Kabbalistic name for God, calls infinity, the boundless ethical claim of the other upon the human subject, Marcel calls a mystery and a presence. Instead of the Levinasian face, Marcel speaks of a confronting, which paradoxically entails one's assumption of in the present of responsibility for the past, one's own and that of another, and a disposability or availability, akin to Levinas's notion of substitution, to stand in the other's stead. To these topics we shall return in part 2 of this paper. For now, perhaps the affinity here between Levinas and Marcel, despite this terminological difference, can best be illustrated by a passage taken from the end of Marcel's 1949 Gifford lectures. There, Marcel brings up the example of the mysterious character that attaches to the presence near one of a sleeping person, especially a sleeping child. Although from the perspective of physical activity, the child who sleeps is completely unprotected and appears to be utterly in our power, from the point of view of mystery, the very vulnerability of the child, its exposure, renders it also invulnerable and sacred. The sacredness of the unprotected, Marcel remarks, lies at the roots of what we might call a metaphysics of hospitality. In a world dominated by the ideas of efficiency and output, an attitude of reverence toward the guest, toward the wounded, toward the sick, will appear at first incomprehensible and later absurd, according to Marcel. But for that very reason, philosophy must be roused from its own sleep to defend something really essential, namely the sacredness of the defenseless. Awakening philosophy to ethics, the biblical call. Comparing and contrasting his own work to that of Marcel, Levinas praises Marcel's sublime work as a saying, a new signifying of the meaningful that awakens the merely said to new life. Hailing Marcel's philosophy as remarkably free from any school and deliberately hostile to the objectivist interpretation of being. Levinas lauds its originality in affirming the religious significance of interhuman relations. Levinas criticizes both Buber and Marcel, however, for the incompleteness of their break with ontology, the high Western tradition for which the supreme characterization of the divine amounts to identifying it with being. Levinas's own quest for a good beyond being undergirds his atheistic account of the biblical creatio ex nihilo, as well as his reticence to speak of human nature, human rights, and human dignity per se. As Rudy Visker explains, Levinas distinguishes between the face of the other and his or her form in order to link the dignity of the needy person to a who-ness that exceeds their whatness, to a face that can, in Levinas's terms, be stripped of its very form. While Levinas's aversion to ontology as a state-issued philosophy of power partly bespeaks his traumatic inheritance from Heidegger, it also reflects in positive terms a Jewish particularism, a Hebraic exegesis of key biblical passages. If Marcel remains firmly committed to an ontological mystery, even as he opens up a new chapter in the history of philosophy, that commitment bears witness similarly to a Christian reading of the Bible. In an essay entitled In the Image of God, according to Rabbi Chaim Volodziner, Levinas pays tribute to an 18th century rabbi from Lithuania, Levinas's own homeland. A student of the Gaon of Vilna, Rabbi Chaim Volodzin founded an influential yeshiva credited with protecting Jews from assimilation and promoting a profound study of the Talmud, the Bible, and the Kabbalah. In his essay, Levinas focuses on the rabbi's posthumously published book, Nefesh HaHayim, The Soul of Life, describing its contents, which, quote, establish the meaning of the humanity of man in the general economy of creation, and offer, Levinas argues, a vision of the human which is still meaningful today. The relevance of this essay to our topic of human dignity becomes immediately obvious when Levinas, citing Genesis 1:27 and Genesis 5:1, observes, quote, the humanity of man in Nefesh HaHayim is understood not in the light of the rational animality of the Greeks, but in the light of the biblical notion of man created in the image of God, unquote. Levinas's text describes a diagrammatic representation of humanity as extending in a man's body from the base of the created order to its height, similar to the trunk of a rooted tree of life, Genesis 2:9, surrounded by branches and fruits. Humanity's structure, Levinas remarks, is unique, simultaneously at the bottom of the ladder and rooted above the throne. Levinas interprets this vertical placement within all the levels of the real to mean simply this: all depends on man, who either sustains the coherence of the whole system through his uprightness or destroys it through his transgression, and who exercises his mastery and responsibility as a mediator between Elohim and the worlds by ensuring the presence or absence of Elohim to them. Incapable of harming the utterly transcendent God, whom he cannot define, formulate, think, or even name, but capable of destroying entire worlds through disobedience to God's commandment, man experiences, according to Levinas, the fear of God precisely as the fear for others. Elsewhere, Levinas asserts, to be in the image of God does not mean to be an icon of God, but to find oneself in his trace. This distinction draws a concise contrast between Levinas's biblical exegesis and that of Christian commentators from the time of Augustine, who understood humanity's creation in the image of God to mean humanity's creation in Christ, the very image of God, the Word who was God and who was in the beginning with God. In view of the Son's predestined incarnation, the creation of Adam as a creature of body and soul, a hypostasis of flesh and spirit, was seen to be always already patterned on the coming Word made flesh, the new Adam, Christ. Marcel invokes this tradition in his use of the lowercase word incarnation, which he uses to describe the existential experience of having a body, my body, inseparable from one's I, but not identical in being with it. To be incarnated is to appear to oneself as body, and this particular body, without being identified with it, nor distinguished from it. Levinas calls this one of Marcel's most beautiful constructions, one that makes the quasi-otherness of one's own body a medium of real contact and communion, of co-presence with every other incarnated being. In Marcel's words, as quoted by Levinas, when I affirm that a thing exists, it is always the case that I consider that thing as linked to my body, as capable of being put in contact with it, however indirectly, unquote. Language itself and the thoughted conditions are therefore, for Marcel and Levinas alike, incarnate. Echoing Marcel, Levinas speaks of a consciousness whose incarnation offers new powers to a soul no longer paralytic, powers of welcome, of gift, of full hands, of hospitality. Levinas discovers a human dignity in the very responsibility for creation that is God-given to the man made in the image of God. So too, Marcel names a human dignity in a divine origin, in man's creation in and through the Word made flesh. For the Christian, Marcel explains, there is an essential agreement between Christianity and human nature. Hence, the more deeply one penetrates into human nature, the more one finds oneself situated on the axes of the great truths of Christianity. Thus, Marcel's explorations of incarnation in the lower case, incarnation, mine and yours, relate to, quote, that other incarnation, to the dogma of the incarnation, as philosophical mysteries do to revealed mysteries, unquote. The destiny of Christ, called the firstborn of many brothers, Romans 8:29, and that of Israel, the Lord's firstborn son, Exodus 4:22, stand mysteriously prefigured for Christians and Jews alike in the story of Abel, murdered by his older brother Cain. The same verb that defines the watchful responsibility of humans who are called to till and keep the garden appears again in Cain's self-defensive question to God, am I my brother's keeper? Genesis 4:9. Levinas comments explicitly in several places upon this biblical episode, whereas Marcel's commentary remains oblique. What is striking is that both Levinas and Marcel emphasize the ethical demand to take responsibility for the brother's murder, both by assuming one's own guilt and by helping to bear the others. In a profound understanding, the mark placed on Cain by God in Genesis becomes, for Levinas, the very emblem of his human dignity. The commandment Levinas reads in the face of every vulnerable fugitive and wanderer. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who came upon him should kill him. Mikhail ben Naphtali discovers the name of Abel hidden in those passages where Levinas refers to Cain. Scripture records that Cain's face fell in an attitude of crestfallen sullenness, anger, and envy when he saw that the Lord had no regard for his offering, but rather accepted Abel's. From a Levinasian perspective, this fall of the face makes the optics of ethics impossible. It paves the way for a killing and a death that Cain should have already known as a sort of impossibility, an interdiction that Levinas says looks at me as the eye that in the tomb shall look at Cain. Always his brother's keeper, Cain cannot escape his responsibility for his brother and for his brother's death. He is held hostage to it. To be, in contrast to Cain's vision of the world, guardian of the other, is the definition of fraternity. Confronted and cursed by God, Cain cries out, quote, "My punishment," or more precisely, my fault, avoni, is more than I can bear, Genesis 4:13. An admission of guilt and a cry for mercy that God answers by imposing on Cain a protective mark. Following Levinas, Ben Naphtali interprets this mark as an incorporation of Cain into Abel into Cain, who becomes Cain Abel through an ethical substitution that leaves the survivor guilty, but sustained in bearing his guilt for the other, mysteriously by the other. If one's dignity can be defined as the holding of a high office, laden with grave responsibilities, then human dignity for Levinas is at once a summoning to and a bearing of responsibility for the mortal, vulnerable, guilty other. Indeed, a Cain-like responsibility for the other's death. Death, source of all myths, including that of Cain and Abel, is present only in the other, Levinas muses, and only in him does it summon me urgently to my final essence, to my responsibility. To give the answer of Abraham and of the prophets, "Here I am," a Levinasian answer of witness in the accusative, me voici, that glorifies the infinite, is to atone, Ephraim Mayer suggests, for Cain's surly response, "Am I my brother's keeper?" It is also to say with Dostoevsky's Aloysia Karamazov, a hyperbolic statement oft-quoted by Levinas, "We are all guilty of all, and for all men, before all, and I more than the others." As Levinas explains, to be human means to live as if one were not just a being among beings. Responsibility is what is incumbent upon me exclusively, and what humanly I cannot refuse. This charge is the supreme dignity of the unique human being, my inalienable identity as subject. Like Levinas, Marcel connects the dignity of an election, of being chosen, to an increase in responsibility. Election, in the Christian sense of the word, is measured primarily by an increase in responsibility resting on the person who is elected. Marcel imagines a person who enters a real and inescapable situation, which includes and entails the others who are also present with that person at the historical event in question, perhaps at the scene of an accident or a crime. Confronting this existential situation is, in Marcel's analysis, the relatively passive first step in a process that entails an assumption of responsibility by the one who has been elected as a witness, whether to his own guilt or to that of another. Confronting a situation means, in a sense, assuming it, writes Marcel, as one assumes responsibility for one's own act, treating it as one's own. To assume the burden of the other's errors, he writes elsewhere, is not to impute them as a crime to the other, but to sharpen the inner awareness of personal shortcomings and obligations. Employing a grammatical logic not unlike Levinas's own, Marcel analyzes such expressions as, "I belong to myself," "I'm responsible for myself." Such sentences already indicate an inescapable bond between the self and the other, Marcel argues, because everything must be interpreted as though I were two persons, at once the older and the younger brother to myself. Marcel glosses the image of the two brothers as an allusion not to Abel and Cain, but to, quote, two orphaned brothers, one of whom is responsible for the other and at the other's disposal. Commenting on this passage in Marcel's writings, Robert Gibbs finds it remarkable, both for its anticipation of Levinas's notion of substitution and for the profound Christological reflection it inaugurs. For Marcel, the I that responds in fidelity to the call of the human you is always already necessarily supported by, preceded by, another you, the absolute you, who mediates between them and to whom the I actually belongs, because that you, Christ, has already substituted himself for each one's I and wills each one to substitute himself for the brothers and sisters, bearing their burdens. Indeed, Marcel prays, who am I to pretend that I do not belong to you? For Marcel, who converted to Catholicism in 1929, the dignity of the responsible person, the servant, is ultimately Christ, the image of the invisible God, in whom man was created. It is precisely because he, Christ, is not someone else that he can arrogate to himself this right of command over me, Marcel meditates, but only to the extent that he becomes more internal to me than I am to myself. In the heart of Christ, an infinite weakness is conjoined with a sovereign strength in order to accommodate what Marcel names the radical exigence of our freedom. For Marcel, the radical exigence of freedom expresses itself in the giving of one's life for another. Marcel and Levinas both recall a pivotal moment at the 1937 Descartes Congress, during which the dark mood of the time stimulated much discussion of Heidegger's anxiety toward death, among other topics. Leon Brunswick famously quipped, "I think that the death of Leon Brunswick preoccupies Leon Brunswick less than the death of Gabriel Marcel preoccupies Gabriel Marcel." To which Marcel replied to his philosopher friend that, quote, "The only thing worth preoccupying either of us is the death of someone we have loved." When Marcel claims that we can find in man's attitude itself, in man's finitude itself, the principle of his essential dignity, he opens up a discussion oriented not toward anxiety, but toward faith, fidelity, hope, and love. The finitude and unicity of each person defines the human being precisely as that which is not replaceable. The discovery of this truth, whether in a relationship of love or conflict, and earthly relations tend to partake of both, leads one to conceive a mode of existence which is different from the one we have known, and which will lead us toward the real and pleromatic unity where we will be all in all. A unity to which Marcel, a lover of music and a composer, imagines to be like that of an orchestra playing an intricate, dynamic, and surpassingly beautiful musical composition, or like a fraternal communion where each one is somehow enriched by everything which enriches his brother. Moved by love and fidelity, one places one's hope in the other, who mysteriously sustains the survivor from beyond the grave. Because the I both is and is not to be identified with my body, because you cannot be reduced to your body, one simply cannot, while one lives, conceive either of one's own or of the other's death as a ceasing to be. To do so in the case of a beloved person would, above all, be an ethical impossibility, according to Marcel, a betrayal, even a murder. Complementing the commandment, "You shall not kill," is a prophecy of the psalmist, "I shall not die but live," Psalm 118:17, fittingly paraphrased as a command in the title of Marcel's posthumously published book, "Thou shalt not die." In Marcel's thought, giving up one's life for another person or cause, or consciously surrendering it to God as to the absolute you, is an extension to the ultimate of that disposability exemplified in the fact of dedicating oneself in service to others during this life, an extension that proves one has placed or situated one's being beyond life. The polite and profound "after you, sir" of Levinas thus becomes an afterlife in Marcel's intersubjective Christian existentialism. Human dignity and the humanities. This last section of the paper is shorter. For both Levinas and Marcel, the foregoing philosophical and theological investigations entailed a call to action. Levinas devoted himself to education, teaching at and administering the École Normale Israélite Orientale in Paris, before assuming professorships at the University of Poitiers, University of Paris, and the Sorbonne. In a series of colloquia and in notable lectures, he urged a revival of Jewish education and Talmudic study for the sake of a new humanities, protective of the most vulnerable. Similarly, Marcel called in his writings for each of us, within his own proper field, in his profession, to pursue an unrelenting struggle for man, for the dignity of man. An independent scholar who never held a regular faculty appointment, Marcel composed 30 plays between 1905 and 1960, existential dramas with philosophical themes, mainly performed in Paris, but some of them also produced in Germany, England, Austria, Belgium, Holland, and the US. Marcel's dramatic investment as a means of spiritual formation and intellectual discovery stands in close proximity to Levinas's emphasis in Totality and Infinity on the saying, in contrast to the said, to his notion of the face as speaking, and to his idea of the other as teacher. In an important 2012 book, Levinas and the Crisis of Humanism, Claire Lise Katz studies Levinas's writings on education and shows their intrinsic connection to his philosophical work. For our purpose here, I focus on a single essay, Anti-Humanism in Education, where Levinas sketches the historical relationship between the principles of humanism, which were those of 1798, on the one hand, and developments in the schools, secular and religiously affiliated alike, on the other. According to his analysis, the humanities curriculum, originally constructed to enshrine the humanism of the Enlightenment, first evolved into a fine arts lacking in biblical wisdom, and then, having reached the philosophical conclusion of the death of God, turned into an anti-humanism, opposed not merely to the fine arts, but to the essence of man, whose irreducibility and supremacy are the basis of the Old Testament. Thus, what indisputably began with a respect for man and the promotion of man's freedom against oppressive laws turned into a lawlessness, that of the will to power, and precipitated the crisis of humanism, which began in the inhuman events of recent history. On the basis of this analysis, Levinas argues for the universal importance of Jewish education, which is especially suited to impart biblical wisdom and to teach respect for the external act made in obedience to the law. On behalf of the nations, of humanity as a whole, Levinas urges a return to Judaism, to Jewish thought and practice, to the observance of commandment. These are efforts, he writes, that are now necessary to save man, to preserve the humanity and personality of man. For Levinas, the Bible is the book par excellence, indispensable to what he calls true humanism. His recommended course of study in the humanities includes, in addition, the Russian classics, Pushkin, Lermontov, Gogol, Turgenev, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and also the great writers of Western Europe, notably Shakespeare, much admired in Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear. In Levinas's understanding, as in Marcel's, such writings are already philosophical in the sense that they pose and explore questions about the ultimate meaning of the human. In his William James lectures, The Existential Background of Human Dignity, and elsewhere, Marcel refers frequently to his own plays, summarizes their plots, quotes from them, allowing his characters to speak otherwise, to say otherwise, what he himself has pronounced more generally and abstractly. The method expresses Marcel's principled resistance to a dehumanizing ideological abstraction, whether in philosophy or politics, which forgets a concrete instance of persons and situations, and thus cuts itself off from the very ground of genuine thinking. In sharp contrast to Bertolt Brecht's epic theater, his own dramas do not, Marcel insists, originate as intended illustrations of his philosophical ideas, but give rise, as it were, to them, both in the mind of the playwright himself and in the audience who witnesses the action on stage. To prove his point, Marcel points to his 1936 play, Le Dard, The Sting, as a precursor of and a sort of research for his 1952 book, Man Against Mass Society, and his 1961 lectures at Harvard on human dignity. Marcel numbers Le Dard, never published in English translation, among the most significant of his writings. Composed at a troubled time when France was stirred by the labor strikes that gave rise to the Popular Front, and witnessing an influx of Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany, the play, according to Marcel's own later analysis, dramatizes, quote, two different or even opposite conceptions of man, of his essential dignity, through an opposition that takes place in relation to the two central characters and to the concrete situation in which they are involved. Marcel's hero, Bernard Schnee, lives in an intersubjective relationship to his Jewish friends Rudolf Schönkrahl, for whom he bears responsibility at the risk of his own life. Recalling the heroism of Catholics who put themselves at risk to save Jewish children and adults during the Shoah, to witness to a common humanity, Levinas insists on the necessity of Jews and Christians alike to verify the truth of God, which is also human truth, through living one's life, risking one's life for others, in reply to the love of God. Placing Levinas and Marcel together, as we have done, in this conversation about human dignity, the two ways, Jewish and Christian, about which Levinas speaks, seems to share a common end in that love which is stronger than death, the love that is, in Marcel's terms, a creative fidelity, the very vocation of man.
Well, friends, we probably have time for one question.
When there's only one, you want to make it count. It's when there's only one. Okay, thank you.
One of the things that's always struck me about Levinas and similarly with Marcel is that although, and in many ways your own talk illustrates this, they talk a great deal about responsibility and relation and all of that in a kind of very dynamic way, and studiously avoid what we might call metaphysical applications or implications. And even the term dignity, as you mentioned, is not really widely broached by them. It's sort of on the edges of their thought. Is one of the problems a kind of absence of anything, particularly an absence of a notion of the person as something that might hang all of this together in a way that they both seem allergic to that, because persons are always seen then as kind of entities or individuals or substances, or, all of those aspects.
Yeah, I was very helped by this essay by Rudy Viskers, where he critiques Levinas, for his allergic response, to engaging what he calls ontology, and says that, well, really, some ontology is needed, right? It's almost as if the pendulum has shifted too far to the other side, and he in that essay, Viskers says, well, the other the victim, right? The victim has a right to more than that I should feel guilty when I, don't care for them, right? That there's at some level there's a place for human rights that we don't find. When Levinas talks about human rights, he immediately envisions, a conflict of rights. When and he wasn't altogether enthused, about the UN statement. Because he could only imagine this being a conflictual relationship, and so I would agree with Viskers that there's got to be some pushback on that point, but again understanding where they were, in what context they were writing, it's very understandable that they took the stance they did, and we have to be grateful to them for that. Thank you.